Hello, everyone. This is Estrella, and with me is Henry-Cameron Allen, and we are from Healing Harmony and Hope with another episode of Unlearning and Relearning. And with us, we have Caro Brookings, who is going to be speaking with us about what she does and why. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about Caro. Caro is a certified neurocoach and suicide bereavement coach. As a math nerd with a BS in mathematics and actuarial science, Caro never thought that she would write a book someday, especially one for suicide loss survivors. God had other plans. At the age of 23, and during her last year of university, she lost her mom to suicide. Caro struggled with the complex grief that comes with such a loss, including feelings of guilt and heartbreak, as well as asking questions like why and what if. When Caro's first daughter was born, she took her healing into her own hands and rewired her brain, especially around her self-blame regarding her mom's suicide. Recognizing that it changed her life and knowing that there wasn't enough support out there for suicide loss survivors. Caro combined all of her knowledge and experience and has since been supporting others in a variety of ways, including individual coaching, group coaching, and self-created online courses, as well as hosting interview series, support series, master classes, and more. She has been featured in a number of interview series and podcasts, including the Conscious Grief series, the Leftover Pieces podcast, and the Open to Hope podcast. Caro grew up in Germany, and after spending a decade in England, she now calls New Brunswick, Canada, her home. Having recently become a Canadian citizen. Yay, Caro. When Caro isn't helping other people, she loves being active with her young family, making her own skincare products. I'd like to hear more about that, as well as reading books on self-development and spirituality. So welcome, Caro. We are so excited to have you with us today.
Thank you.
We are ready to start our conversation. Henry, how would you like to get started with some questions for Caro?
Well, Caro, great to meet you. Welcome to Unlearning. And it's an interesting conversation to bring up because you're right, there's very little support or conversation. Suicide is a very touchy subject. People don't know how to talk about it. People don't know how to support others around them and handle one another's grief, let alone their own. Where did you find it in yourself to have this impulse to help other people sort of on their journey?
Good question. I think for me it was struggling myself with the suicide of my mom, and for years just trying to really put my head down and live on autopilot and live my life. Like Estrella was saying, I wasn't planning on really doing any of this. And then when my first daughter was born, things changed for me because, it was my mom who took her life. So you already kind of think, okay, it was my mom. And then her mom had suffered from depression and was treated in and out of hospital for a lot of her life. So it crossed my mind before, what does that mean about me? It was my mom's son, it was my mom, now me. But then when my daughter was born, is like the female in the next generation, I sort of felt, okay, things had to change. I needed to change. That's when I found a program on rewiring my own brain, and it it changed my life. I rewired my brain around the guilt I had, especially the whys, the what ifs, and all of that. And sort of while I was on this journey, I realized quite quickly that there's not enough support out there for as suicide loss survivors, through my own journey and family members as well. But I never really thought it was my role to change that. But yeah, I was inspired once my daughter was born, and once it changed my own life. I sort of, the thing is with the neurocoaching, it's all about looking at our thoughts. Like, not all of our thoughts are true, they're not all helpful. So in the past, I've had thoughts around, oh, well, I've got a degree in math, yes, I've got the neurocoaching certification that I did later, but I never necessarily felt equipped to do the work. So by going through this program and then completing my neurocoaching certification, it was interesting because I was able to rewire my brain around that as well. And then I just started to put myself out there, put the feelers out, just start appearing on social media. And I started by having a small group and then starting the interview series, and the ball just kept rolling from that day forward.
Can you talk a little bit more about neurocoaching? I've never heard of it. I'm
Okay.
sure I'm not alone in that.
Yeah.
But please share not only what it is, but I'm really interested in your particular technique and how you discovered neurocoaching.
Yeah. So, like I said, the way I discovered that 3-month program, which was, where other neurocoaches helped me, where, I wasn't qualified to do anything. It was interesting how I found that. I had like a fitness app where I was doing different exercises, and there was an ad that popped up that caught my eye, and that's how I kind of found that. But I definitely believe in divine intervention, because I had been looking for things to do, for something to help myself. But I found it was either, something that helped one person, but it wouldn't necessarily help other people, or it would be something that someone just made up out of thin air. But I really love the neuroscience part of it because, I've got a degree in math. I'm very sciencey. So I know that it works, and it does work. So in terms of the neurocoaching, so coaching is obviously different to counseling. So coaching in general, for people who don't know, it's very action oriented, it's very present and forward focused. And then the neuro part of it is basically all about how the brain works. So I already mentioned that not all of our thoughts are true and are helpful. So recognizing that is a big first step. And then there's tools around rewiring the brain, because around 95% of what we do is driven by our subconscious, which means that we're not even aware of it. Like, we walk around and we think we consciously make all of these decisions, but it's not actually true. So that's why it's really important to rewire the brain, because then the subconscious is working for us rather than against us. And like I said, there's tools of how you can take an untrue thought, refute it, and then rewire the brain.
Excellent. Very excellent. That is very interesting. As a matter of fact, you and I have known each other for a little over a year, maybe a couple of years. How did we meet? Do you remember?
I think I found you to interview you as part of my interview series.
That's right. I've done 2 of those, and they have been amazing, because I know it helps other people, helps those who are listening. But one of the reasons that I became involved, and like you, never in a million years would I have thought I would be doing what I'm doing today. my son died by suicide in 2013. And like many of your clients, I struggled with my identity as a person. I struggled with questions of, did I not do enough? Should I have done this? Am I still a mother? And I was really punishing myself until I realized, and I did go through counseling, that I was actually thinking those thoughts and they were not serving me. So it's a matter of rewiring and rethinking that. So it sounds like a very intricate process. How long does it take for someone to rewire their brain?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's a straightforward answer, but I want to sort of talk a little bit more around the process. So
Okay.
the rewiring of the brain starts with, like I said, recognizing an untrue or unhelpful thought. So it might be, my loved one's suicide is all my fault, for example. That's a classic thought. So you recognize the thought, you write it down with pen and paper, and then you go through the refuting process. So there's two parts to that. There's the logical refute, where we come up with logical reasons of why that's not true. So, for example, in our case, my loved one's suicide is all my fault. We might be able to think of what I call outside influences. So things that have influenced the loved one's life or may have contributed to their suicide, which we had no control over. That, logically you can say, okay, well, there were all these other things, so it's not all my fault. Or we might come up with a list of things that we did do to support our loved ones, because what the brain tends to do, it tends to look on the negative side, and it tends to want to hold on to these negative thoughts. It wants to hold on to the guilt. And the reason for that is as long as we believe that we had control to change the outcome, it means that everything's predictable, right? So if the brain is to let go of that control and acknowledge that those thoughts aren't true, it kind of feels helpless because, it recognizes, okay, there's nothing I could have done, which is scary to the brain. But anyway, back to the refuting. So you've got the logical refute, which you just talked about, and then there's the mirror refute, where you basically take the statement, so my loved one's suicide is all my fault, and you mirror it onto the person you love the most. So generally, I say it's most powerful if we mirror it on the loved one who took their life, but it can also be stressful, right? So I always tell my clients, and when I work through it with them, we see how it goes. And then if it's too stressful, we can always mirror it on someone else who's still alive, because it still works. But what we do is when we mirror it onto that person, we basically say it about them. So say the loved one I'm mirroring it on is called Bob, then I would say, oh, my loved one's suicide is all Bob's fault. And what happens is that we start to defend them, right? Because we've got compassion for other people that we don't have for ourselves. So we say, well, no, that's not true. It's not all their fault because of all of these different reasons that we have for them that we don't find for us, even though a lot of them will be true for us as well. So what we can do is we can write down all the reasons we come up for them, and then just look at them and see which one are true for us as well. So we've done the logical refute, we've done the mirror refute, and we've come up with all of these different statements and what we want to do next. So that's really the most difficult part, is just to do the refute. The rest is quite straightforward, really. And that's the beauty of it as well. So, you can get out a voice recorder. Most phones have one these days, and you read each statement out loud and put it onto that recording, and then listen to it first thing in the morning. So it sets us up well for the day, because you've got these much more positive thoughts in our minds. And then last thing at night as well, because the subconscious is always active. So we give the subconscious what we wanted to work through, which is, again, more positive thoughts. Now, studies have shown that the whole rewiring of the brain takes around 67 days. So what we say when we talk about rewiring, basically, there's lots of neural pathways in the brain. So, okay, I'm getting quite technical, but I feel like I want to explain all of that. So basically what happens, if we have a conscious thought, there's a gap in the neural pathways, and the brain needs to use energy for the thought to jump across. Now, what happens if we have a thought over and over again? The brain's like, all right, I get it. You really believe that thought. What I'm going to do is I'm going to close the gap. So there's no gap there. So you don't need to use any energy to think the thought. So it conserves energy, but then you also have no control or no awareness of the thoughts that are happening. So what we're doing when we're rewiring the brain is we're breaking down those old neural pathways, those old thoughts, and we're building new neural pathways for the new thoughts. So that's what happens when we say rewiring of the brain, and we can take brain scans at different stages. So that's how we get to the 67 days, just by taking the brain scans. Now, usually, because it's a process, right? It doesn't just happen from one day to the next. After about 3 weeks, people will start to feel a difference, and they're sort of noticing that they maybe don't quite believe those old thoughts anymore, and those new thoughts are a bit more reasonable, let's say. So I always say to people, check in with yourselves regularly and see, okay, am I still believing the old thought? How am I feeling about the new thought? And, it's most recordings, especially initially, they might be like 1 or 2 minutes long max. So, listening to a recording for a couple of minutes in the morning, a couple of minutes at night is really not much effort, considering the changes that it brings. And we also have to realize that a lot of these thoughts and these deep-seated beliefs, we didn't just suddenly get them when our loved ones took their lives, even if it's related to the suicide. Usually they're beliefs that we've been holding for decades. So again, saying around 67 days to change a belief system that we may have held for decades sounds like a good deal to me.
Yeah, it's like the old adage, the more you hear something, the more you're apt to believe it. And that's whether it's outside of you, programming that you've received generationally, right? Or culturally, or through media. But then there's also the inner voice that sort of supports and reinforces that programming. How does one make the jump to recognize that those thoughts may be false, or how does one start questioning? Because we know, having, I don't have experience with suicide, but my son passed from brain cancer 16 years ago. And I've been through my own unique grief journey, and sort of, in a sense, rewiring and looking at the grief journey through a different perspective, I think, than most. And what I find in my own clients, I'm a certified grief and survival counselor, and what I find is that they get caught very often, we get caught in this, what I call a vortex of mourning, that is really hard for some people to break out of, and to break out of mourning into grieving, into active grieving, right? Because mourning is a temporary and passive state. There's nothing you can do with it but be in it until you're not. You cross through this thin membrane into the act of grieving, which is permanent, right? And it's active. You can actually channel it into good things. You can do something with your grief. And so how does one go from that vortex of mourning, not quite knowing how they feel? Often with suicide, shock accompanies it, right? So you're in shock for a period of time. Your whole universe has exploded. You don't know which way is up or even how you're feeling or how to feel about it. And then as the dust settles a little bit and you start asking yourself those questions and having those thoughts of what could I have done better? What could I have done differently to save my loved one from that act? Could I have even, right? How does one break through into recognizing that those thoughts are not helpful and those thoughts are not serving? That's a big question that I have.
Yeah, yeah. Again, a great question. And the first thing, like you said, that phase of shock, and it can last for months, it can last, for a year or more.
Yeah.
What I find personally is, like you said, we're all wrapped up in our own stories, like all of us, and not just to do with grief, with anything. So, and we're convinced that those stories we tell ourselves are true. So it can be quite difficult to break through that. What I find personally is working with someone like a coach or a counselor can help, because they can sort of break it down for you, maybe offer a different perspective, or even talking to a friend. I talk about the kind patient and non-judgmental people, but really getting it out of your own head. So I feel like when we keep things in our own mind, we just go down the rabbit hole and just keep going round and round in circles. When we're able to share it with others, then it loses power over us. There's it's never too early or too late. I've worked with a client who lost her son to suicide, and she started working with me 2.5 months after she lost her son, and we made great progress together. And some people, they need maybe a year or longer to reach out, but yeah, I think it's a great point. We're all got our stories and our belief system, because that's how we identify ourselves, right? We've got all of these categories and stories and all of that. One thing that people might be able to do as well is just think about how it makes them feel. So if they've got a certain thought and it doesn't make them feel good, then, or it makes them feel sad or guilty or whatever it is, that might be something to sort of investigate a little bit more, because there is that inner voice. Like, for people who are familiar with Michael Singer, who wrote the Surrender Experiment and the Untethered Soul, Living Untethered, he talks about that inner roommate. And I think that's a really great way to imagine that voice, because there's us and there's like the higher self, who is more of a whisper, but it's the things that are good for us and helpful for us. And then there's what he calls that inner roommate, who's really loud and obnoxious and talks to us all day. And to be able to recognize, okay, there's these thoughts and these thoughts are not me, that can really help to make that distinction as well.
Excellent.
How do your clients find you? Like, for if they're really feeling lost and they don't know where to turn. Many of my clients are men, and that's a whole other conversation about how men deal with and handle grief and find comfort. And culturally, I think globally, we are expected to not ask for help and not seek. We have to fix it ourselves, within ourselves, and be the rock for everybody around us. How do people, so there are going to be a lot of people seeing you, men and women, on this conversation. How do they find you generally?
So, well, through when I was doing my interview series, the speakers kindly sort of shared with their audiences, and that's how we were able to reach a lot of people. I'm writing a book right now, where the pre-sale is imminent. So I'm hoping, people, they like to read books, and I like to share all the tools and everything. So that'll be another avenue. But I've also got a private Facebook group of nearly 1,000 members. So that's how I find, people search on Facebook, even though, even searching for the word suicide, and, it's a good thing. Facebook and Google, they come up and say, okay, are you sure you want to search for this? Do you need help? So you kind of need to go through that barrier, but that's where people tend to find me.
Excellent. So we will definitely add some of that information at the end of this podcast so that people will be able to find you. I have a specific question because I dealt with this as a suicide survivor. So I understand about the rewiring of the brain, because really change begins with us first. But how do your clients react to the stigma that suicide has attached to it? You see, as we know, when someone dies of an illness, people are compassionate. When someone dies in an accident, they're compassionate towards the family, towards that person that passed. But when a loved one chooses suicide as a way to exit, there is stigma. There are a lot of questions that people ask, mainly of the family of the deceased. They want to know, why did he do it? Was it the family unit? Was there any kind of tension and pressure that drove that person to do what they did? What are your thoughts on that? And how do you work with your clients when they come to that point where they need to, once they have gone through the process that you just described, how do they address stigma? How do they face society?
Yeah. Again, great question. So firstly, you mentioned that, when a person chooses suicide, so I personally don't think, maybe a very small minority, but I think the vast majority of people don't choose to take their lives. Again, I've done a lot of research about that when I was writing my book, and there's physical changes in the brain happening that are invisible to the naked eye. And, I've talked to suicide attempt survivors, and they say when they get to that point, it's like they've got this tunnel vision. It's like they're in this slippery funnel. They can't even make a decision at that point. It's like as if it's being made for them. And, with my mom taking her life in the circumstances, I can see that for her as well. It's as if a switch got flipped, and that was it. There was nothing else going on. But like you said, stigma is a big thing that we face. And it's interesting, some people face it right from the start, and other people, they seem to feel like, oh, I've got a support system and everything's good. And then 3 years down the line, suddenly, someone might say, oh, well, how long are you going to be doing this for, or something, right? So I always say to my clients, find your kind, patient, and non-judgmental people. Your address book is going to shrink. We've all experienced that. But really, it's quality over quantity. So I'd rather people have like 2, 3, 5 people who they can really rely on and go to and be themselves, than having 20 people where they have to put on the mask and pretend they're okay when they're not. And then the second thing, which is really key, is to realize that, we can't control what other people say and do. People are gonna do what they're gonna do, but also to recognize that whatever other people say and do, it reflects back on them. It reflects back on their values, their upbringing, their experiences, their beliefs. and it means nothing about us or our loved ones. And you can see that when, you're in a room with 10 people and you tell them all the same story, and you probably have 10 different reactions, because it's not about us, it's about them. And, people need to be reminded of that, because it is painful and it is hurtful, especially if the stigma and the comments come from people who we thought would support us, right? But just to realize that it's all about them and it's got nothing to do with us, and we can't change other people. And that goes a long way.
That's a really important point, because as we know, when a loved one passes, whether it's a parent, a child, someone close to us, our partner, a friend, quite often people will disappear from our lives because they can't cope with the weight of our grief, let alone their own, right? And how do you guide your clients to, again, sort of rewire and navigate the guilt around that? Did I do something wrong that they disappeared from my life, this trusted friend or a family member? People tend to back away when you've experienced the passing of a loved one, however they go.
Yeah, true. And that's why it's so important that we have someone to talk to, so we can say, well, this is not your fault. And also I find it's really helpful to know that we're not the only ones experiencing that. So as well as one-on-one coaching, I've got a small group who I coach and I support, and I say to them, one-on-one is one thing, and then the group adds a whole nother level to it, because we can all talk to each other, we can share ideas, share perspectives, share experiences, and we can realize, okay, I'm not the only one going through this, and here are my people who I can rely on. And we've made some great friendships over time. Even though it's virtually, it's just great to have each other, to be able to support each other.
Yeah.
Great, great. I have a question. We talk about the people that leave us, right? Why do they leave us? What is it about this journey that is so difficult for them when we are the ones that are experiencing it?
Yeah, the why is a big question, and something that I asked myself for a long time. And when my mum first took her life, I made a list of all the possible reasons, but I was never able to come up with a reason which was good enough for me. Like anything that I could come up with was either temporary, or there was a solution to this. To me, there was nothing that was, like I said, good enough, where it's oh yeah, makes sense. But what I realized over time is that it doesn't matter what it was like to me, it matters what it was like to my mom. So maybe to me all these things were molehills, and to her it was this huge mountain that she wasn't able to climb. So when we think about it in terms of the brain, when we see reality around us, none of us actually see reality as it really is. By the time it hits our brain and our senses, the brain has already filtered on what's important to us. Again, that's why the rewiring is so important, because we tell the brain, okay, this is what means a lot to me, so it'll look out for these things. It's like, the classic example of buying a new car and suddenly you see the same car everywhere. And it's not because there's more of them around, it's because the reticular activating system has been activated. So we're much more aware. So that to say that none of us experience reality as it is, we already interpret it. So each and every one of us have a different version of reality. Each and every one of us have a different view of a person. Like, even you, Estrella, and Henry, you see me differently. Even though I'm talking to both of you, you both have a different, distinct view of
Right.
me. So to say that, going back to what you said earlier, people are going to do what they're going to do, and there's no point trying to please people because you're never going to be able to please everyone. But yeah, with the whys, it's just to realize that, there's never a single reason. There's usually lots of different reasons which all pile up together. And yeah, it's very difficult for us to wrap our heads around it, especially if we haven't struggled with suicidal ideation ourselves,
Right.
to try and understand why.
And I imagine it's
Absolutely.
very similar in not only the loved ones who have left us, but in our circle, people in our immediate circle who back away and leave us. It's a very similar process of understanding that what is unconscionable, like if I had a friend who was suffering in their mourning or shock, I could not imagine backing away and leaving them alone in that grief, right? And to be able to look at those people leaving through the same kind of compassionate lens to say that I can't understand their impulses because I'm not them. I don't hold their biography. I don't have, we can have experienced the same moment together, but we each have a different memory of it, right? As you were
Mhm.
saying. And so to be able to, I think, I think it's important to ask those questions, why, and to make the list like you did with your mom.
Mhm.
Uh, but to make that for the people who leave our lives or are living uh, as well, to make that list and say, okay, here are the scenarios where I could see, does this work for me? Does that make sense to me that they would have backed away? The difference is that we can have an in-person conversation. We can reach out to those people and say, can we talk?
Mhm.
That I can understand where you are, right? It's hard when you're in the throes of grief or mourning, which I see as very different things, um, to take on the responsibility of chasing someone down to be there for you in your need,
Mhm.
right? And still consider their needs. We are not the only ones grieving, usually, around the passing of someone who's
True.
beloved, multiple people. And it's really hard when we're in the early, place of mourning to recognize that anybody else is grieving,
Mhm.
Yeah,
right?
true. It's true. That is, it's an amazing work that you're doing. I think
Yeah.
all of us,
Thank you.
are doing what we are meant to do based on our experiences and the things that we've endured. It has actually, our experiences have moved us in this direction. It's not something that we planned. We had other plans, and here we are. So I have to say that in so many ways, and it's hard to say, I am grateful for the opportunity that I've had to really understand more, uh, and be able to help people who, like me and like you guys, didn't have someone right there at the time to help them understand what this journey is all about. So, Caro, I know you have a book that is coming out. What is the title of your book? And
Um,
where can people find it?
yeah, so thank you. So the book, the working title is Hope, Embracing Life After Suicide Loss. So I've just recently submitted my first draft. I'm working with a publisher, and they've given me some feedback, which I'm in the process of incorporating. So it'll be released officially next spring, so spring of 2025. But pre-sale is happening. So again, we can put a link below. There's different packages available, from getting an ebook, getting a signed paperback copy, and more. So yeah, right now it's pre-sale through the publisher, and then next spring it'll be available on Amazon and different bookstores.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. Henry, is there anything else that you would like to ask Caro?
Not really, but I do want to validate again because I'm like you and like Estrella after a very profound experience of outliving a loved one. I was looking for therapy, I was looking for counseling, and I found different counselors, but none of them were like me. None of them who had been through what I had been through. Uh, I call us peregrines because there's never been a word like widow or orphan for a parent who's outlived a child. And so I was looking for a fellow peregrine. I was looking for somebody to counsel me who had been down that road, and I couldn't find it. It took me 15 years to get my diploma as, in my international certification as a grief and survival counselor, so I could be for others what wasn't there for me. And I want to say that any kind of coaching or therapy, counseling without empathy is useless. And what you are is a jewel, and it's a real gift to those who have also been down the road that you've been down or are going through it, to find somebody who can coach them from an empathetic place. I cannot say enough how that must be valued and talked about, because we've all been there, and we see the lack of support. For me, my focus is mainly on men's grief. I work with women too, but men are very much underserved in the grief world. And so I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your whatever it took in you to step into this new self, this new identity as a helper in the world. We need people like you. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Caro. And as I mentioned to you earlier, at the end of this podcast, we will add information on your book, as well as information where people that need your services can find you. And yes, I agree with Henry 100%. You are a jewel. And I am so glad that we met and we have been collaborating for the last couple of years, and I know it's going to continue this way. So again, thank you. And to our listeners, we want to thank you for joining us today. This is the second episode of
Unlearning.
Wait. This is the second episode of Learning and Relearning with Henry-Cameron Allen and Estrella Tinch. Thank you so very much for joining us. Bye-bye.